Bad news, everyone. The Sony PSVR 2 is a complete and utter failure, according to this article right here. Now, you've probably seen this article if you're part of the VR bubble, or if you use Twitter at all. Every VR content creator and VR journalist, and just people who are interested in VR and tech in general, have been speaking about this article for about a week now. If you haven't seen this, if you've dodged it somehow, let me just hit you with the cliff notes or the abridged version. Bloomberg posted this story on the 30th of March, and effectively what they're saying is Sony are projected to sell fewer than 300,000 PSVR 2 headsets within the first month of launch. So between the 22nd of February, which is when PSVR 2 launched, and the end of March, it looks like they're going to sell around 270 units of the headset, or it looks like they've sold 270,000 units of the headset. Now, if you read that without any context, you'd probably think, that's pretty good. I'm not an analyst. I don't know what's good or bad in the world of brand new, shiny, expensive tech in 2023, but if I heard 270,000 units in a month, I would think, damn, that's pretty good. But I think this article is leaning into the doom and gloom because Sony themselves were quite vocal before launch about wanting to sell around 2 million units within the launch window. Now, I don't know what the launch window means. I don't know if that's a month. I don't know if that's 3 months, 6 months, or a year. But Sony did say that they wanted to shift around 2 million units within the launch window. And if that is a month, they've obviously fallen incredibly far short of that initial goal. Now, the article goes on to make some comparisons to Meta and the Quest 2, even though the Quest 2 has been out for a much longer period of time and has gone through a couple of Christmas cycles, which obviously boost sales. Quest 2, for comparison, has sold around 20 million units to date, but it has had a much longer time in the market. And then they wrap up the article by basically saying that a price cut is probably needed on the PSVR 2 to avoid a complete disaster of their new product. That is a direct quote from the article. Now, a lot of people in the VR community have had quite strong reactions to this article. I think whether you love PSVR 2 or not, if you're in that VR bubble, ultimately you want VR to succeed. You want to see it reach a level where it's adopted by the mainstream. You want to see VR reach a level of success where we start to get really high quality AAA games and content and applications on a regular basis. So everyone's kind of pulling together, or we should be pulling together in the same direction. So when you see an article like this, which is jumping onto a very infantile VR headset, a piece of tech that hasn't even had 2 months on the market to make an impact or find its footing, and they're kind of saying that it's almost doomed unless they chop the price and make some radical changes, I think all of us have quite a strong reaction. I've seen articles like this before regarding VR. I've seen multiple articles, multiple videos that say VR is dead, and they come around every kind of 2 or 3 months. Now, there are parts in this article as well that make me think, sadly, PSVR 2 and VR in general are being lumped in with the metaverse terminology, and also a little bit with crypto. And crypto's going through its own kind of collapse, or it's been going through a kind of long form collapse for quite a while now. And it does feel like some of these articles that are kind of aimed at showing the downfall of VR, or VR not being as successful as it possibly could be, are lumping it in somewhat with crypto because of the metaverse. There's kind of a blurred line between the metaverse and crypto, and it pulls in VR tech as well. Now, the PSVR 2, in my opinion, was always created to be a gaming-first VR device. And this article talks about it as Sony's way into the metaverse. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't know what Sony's plans are. They might want to get into the metaverse thing somewhere down the line and go after Meta's kind of foothold on that. Not that they really have a foothold. The metaverse is a bit of a washout, if you ask me. But my opinion of the PSVR 2 is that it's a gaming-first VR device. It's for VR games and experiences on your PS5. And it has nothing to do with the metaverse. That's how I view it. But this article does talk a lot about it being Sony's way into the metaverse. Now, the reason I'm making this video is I wanted to share my opinions about Sony's launch and talk about whether I think PSVR 2 is a failure based on shifting 270,000 units in a month. So there's 3 or 4 points that I wanted to touch upon today that are inherently tied to the PSVR 2's success or lack thereof. The first point I want to touch upon is VR is still very, very niche, and you forget that if you're part of the VR bubble. When you're in here and you're living it and you're using these things every single day, it's so easy to get swept up and excited about the tech and expect that everyone who loves games would want a VR headset. But it simply isn't the case. Currently, there are 32 million PS5s out there that have been sold and are sitting in people's houses. That's how many PS5s have been sold to date. And you need a PS5 to play the PSVR 2. So already there's an issue there. Not everyone can just run out and buy a PSVR 2. You need a PS5. And if you bolt that onto the cost of the headset, you're looking at over £1,000. Secondly, you can't go and try this thing anywhere. When the PSVR launched, you could go to a game store, I used to work in one, and you could pay for a short demo. You could put it on your head, you could play a couple of games, and you could understand whether it was for you. VR is still a scary unknown for a lot of consumers. They don't know if they're going to like it. They don't know if they have enough space for it. Having enough space to play VR is a huge privilege. A lot of people live in flats, a lot of people live in little box rooms. They might not have the space. So to lay out £550 if they have a PS5, or £1,000 if they don't have a PS5, to potentially try something they don't have enough space for, or something that's going to make them sick because they suffer from motion sickness, that's a massive ask. So there are a potential 32 million PSVR 2 consumers out there, but converting them to actually making a purchase is going to be an absolute challenge for Sony. This was never going to be easy. I actually think it's really impressive that 270,000 units have been sold of a brand new piece of technology, which is effectively an accessory which costs more than the console needed to run the thing in the first place. I think that alone is very, very impressive and speaks volumes of the hunger and enthusiasm of those people who have played VR and who want a high-end VR experience for their console. There's definitely a hunger out there, but how do you convert the other 31.75 million people into believing in this and wanting to go out and spend the same amount of money again on a VR headset? This thing was never going to do gangbusters immediately. It was never going to fly off the shelves, and 270,000 units, I think, is a pretty good start. Now, I'm not Sony. I can't speak for what they want to sell here. I don't know how successful they want this thing to be. But for me, I think that's a pretty strong start, given just how niche VR is right now still, and how it's almost impossible to just go somewhere and try one of these things to see if you want to spend that kind of money again. The second point I want to touch upon today is availability. Here in the UK, if you want a PSVR 2, you need to go to sonydirect.com and order one. I can't walk into a Game or an Argos or a Currys and pick up a PSVR 2 from a bricks and mortar store, which means there is no bricks and mortar advertising. Why would any of these stores give up any space within their units to advertise something they can't sell you? So all that foot traffic in shopping centres that would normally go in, see the PS5, and then next to it see the PSVR and a selection of games and think, oh, what's that? Ask a sales assistant and kind of get some information. None of that is happening anywhere. And I know that's the case in the UK. I don't know what it's like for the rest of the world. Right here, right now, it feels like a soft launch. You can only get it directly through Sony. So a huge chunk of POS, a huge chunk of marketing, point of sale marketing, is just not happening for the PlayStation VR 2. It really isn't happening. Back when I worked at Game, I remember the PSVR launch, and I remember the big push to get people to come in and try it. None of that is happening with PSVR 2. So I think a part of this unit of sales shifted so far is down to marketing and how Sony have approached this launch. It certainly doesn't feel like the widespread launch I was hoping it would have been. There is no chance for someone to pick one up on a whim. I know it's an expensive whim, but there's no chance for someone to walk in and go, you know what, yeah, I'll try one of them, I'll buy one, because it can't be sold in stores right now. So I do hope that by the time we get to Christmas or before Christmas, Sony have rectified that and you can buy it from more retailers and not just from Sony themselves. Thirdly, cost of living crisis. It sounds like a cop-out, but it's a real thing. My food shopping bill has doubled recently, and everything else seems to be going up in price as well. A £550 accessory for your existing £500 luxury console is a huge ask right now. The PSVR 2 launched at a difficult time. It had a lot of things going against it in terms of external factors that Sony cannot control. The world is an expensive place to live in right now. Heating your house costs more than ever, and feeding yourself and your family costs more than ever. So buying a PlayStation VR 2 headset to effectively play, and I'm going to get onto this, to effectively play one game that you can't play anywhere else or any other way, that's a huge ask. So there is a huge cost of living implication here where people just can't afford it. I saw multiple friends on Twitter who are huge VR enthusiasts have a pre-order right up until before launch and then cancel it because they could not justify that cost. So again, considering they've shifted 270,000 units of this thing in a month within a huge cost of living crisis, I think that's pretty good. You know, they're doing okay. Now, the fourth and probably final reason as to why I think the Sony PSVR 2 hasn't exceeded sales expectations or even come close to sales expectations over the first month on the market is the launch lineup of games. Now, let me just take off my rose-tinted glasses for a second and throw them away. I've been using the PSVR 2 since launch, and I've had a really good time with it. But if I'm being completely and utterly honest, there's nothing on that headset that you can't experience somewhere else or in another format, bar one game. Horizon Call of the Mountain is truly the only real exclusive PSVR 2 game. Resident Evil 8 and Gran Turismo can both be played flat. And again, if we're going back to that kind of cost of living crisis argument, if you already own Gran Turismo or you want to play Gran Turismo, you could just play it flat screen. Yes, playing it in VR is absolutely sublime and I think it's the best way to play it. Same with Resident Evil 8, but it's such a luxury to spend £550 for that privilege to play those games in a new way. All the other games that bolstered the PSVR 2's launch lineup are available on the Quest 2, which you can pick up for a fraction of the price. Or they're available on PC VR. Now, if you're already a VR enthusiast, and I'm sure that a big chunk of the 270,000 units of PSVR 2 sold come from VR enthusiasts, people who have already played with a VR headset and know what they're getting into, those people probably owned most of, if not all of, those launch titles. So the incentive for them to pick up a headset was really Gran Turismo, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Resident Evil 8. Now that sounds like a pretty good launch lineup, and I'm not knocking the launch lineup on paper. If you were a new VR user going into it, you had such a wide array of choice and a ton of great games to get stuck into. But really, to shift this kind of exciting new tech to the common, normal consumer, it needed some much bigger profile, sparkly IPs to really make this appeal to a wider audience. Horizon Zero Dawn is a huge franchise, but it's far from Sony's biggest. If this had come along with a God of War VR title, or an Uncharted VR title, or a Last of Us, or a Spider-Man, the conversation might be different, because those IPs have the power, the star power, to attract and potentially convert some normal flat screen consumers into buying and trying VR. I don't think anything really in the launch window for PSVR 2 has been enough to convert people who aren't already converted. They're selling this headset to lovers of VR. They're not yet selling it to people who haven't jumped in yet. And I think that's a big part of why this hasn't reached that kind of lofty 2 million goal that Sony put out there originally. We need some games and experiences that can convert the masses and show people that VR isn't a gimmick and isn't something that is going to get tried once and then chucked onto the shelf. And it's going to take Sony a little while to really create a back catalogue of games that can tell that to people, to show them that there's enough value here in owning this very, very expensive piece of technology. Now, this has been a little bit of a ranty video. I didn't want it to be a long one. I'm going to kind of cut it off here. But ultimately, I think this article is kind of BS in a lot of ways. I think it's BS in the way that it's been positioned. It's very doom and gloom, but What form of media isn't these days? That's how they get their clicks. It's sensationalist. There's truth in the article. 270,000 units of the PSVR 2 have been sold between launch day and the end of March. And that isn't what Sony wanted. But Sony never defined what the launch window was, so maybe it is on track. We won't know until someone from Sony actually comments on this situation. But my true opinion of the PSVR 2 is it struggled for the 4 reasons I've outlined. It hasn't had a full-blown launch, you can't pick it up in stores, the marketing has been subpar. We are living in a cost of living crisis and it is difficult to just survive, let alone go out and buy a £550 accessory. There might be 32 million people out there with PS5s, but only a small percentage of those people are going to want to take a punt on an unknown piece of technology that they can't just go and try at a local retailer or possibly at a friend's house or some kind of exhibition. And finally, the launch lineup. There weren't enough big hitters in there, enough big IPs to convert the non-converted. You're selling this VR headset to VR users who already know how cool VR is. I'm certain that's going to be the majority of those 270,000 units sold. It's going to be people who already know that they love VR, and we need to start converting the others. I think the PSVR 2 is a great headset. I'm really having a good time with it. I've been loving the games I've played so far, and the only real worry that I have ultimately at this stage is what comes next. Because we've gone past that first month now, and I don't know when the next big PSVR 2 game is coming that I'm excited for. That worries me somewhat. I really do hope Sony have a plan and have some content that they're going to start to showcase and roll out to us. Because at this point in time, I think Crossfire Sierra is the only other PSVR 2 game. Oh, and Firewall Ultra. Crossfire Sierra and Firewall Ultra are the 2 PSVR 2 games that I'm excited for. Neither have release dates. Both are shooters. We're going to need a lot more variety, and we're going to need a lot more high-end, sparkly, big-hitting IP if PSVR 2 hopes to hit that lofty 2 million units sold. So ultimately, ignore Bloomberg articles. Don't worry about it. If you bought a PSVR 2, just enjoy it for what it is. I'm really loving my headset. But yeah, there are a lot of reasons as to why this headset might not be succeeding in the ways that Bloomberg and maybe even Sony wanted it to succeed. Hope you've enjoyed watching. If you have, please do leave a like, leave a comment, and hit subscribe. And I'll see you soon for another one. Take care, guys. I'm off to the cinema to watch Mario. Bye-bye.